Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Social Contract, a Commander podcast. I'm Mike Almond, and joining me is my co-host, Alex Lapp. Alex! What's up, man?
Not too much, Mike, and today I am very excited to do a deck tech for probably the deck of mine that you would have the least taste for. Kykar Stack.
I was going to interrupt you and say, like, oh, cool, another group hug. Oh, we're going to do some politics. Oh, we're going to... No.
This actually is quite a political deck.
It is. It is.
This is not your normal stack, Mike.
No, it's truly not. This isn't and I'm saying this with the preface of, don't get me wrong, I haven't changed on all of you. This deck still makes me cringe a little bit, but it makes me cringe in the, I hope I'm not the direction of your lack of affection kind of way. Why don't you give a rundown of what the deck aims to do before we dive into the actual deck itself?
Sure, Mike. So basically what this deck is trying to do is lock down the strongest player at the table with very specific hate pieces that basically prevent their deck from functioning. Now, to make this work, we need very narrow hate pieces, which I call here silver bullets. And you may have heard this term before. It's basically a card that is really only going to hose a very specific archetype or group of archetypes of decks. And it doesn't really do anything to any other archetype. And that's desirable in this case because what I want to do is leave the rest of the table alone and just go rabid dog style on one opponent. So from this description, you can probably intuit this is not a first round deck. This isn't the deck that I bring out at the beginning of the night. This is the deck I like to bring out when somebody has a very powerful deck and they insist, oh, it's not that kind of deck. And I'm like, yes, it definitely is that kind of deck, and you're not being honest. And then it turns out it definitely was that kind of deck. So now I have to bring out Kykar because they say that's their only deck. So that is how the deck is constructed. But what's the goal? Our goal is to find Academy Ruins and Mindslaver and do the Academy Ruins Mindslaver lock.
Yeah.
You'd say, but Lapper, that only locks one player. Well, that's all I want to do.
Yep.
It's lock one player.
This is how do we put this? Targeted stacks is a thing. Because this deck proves that it's a thing.
It's way less efficient than normal stacks.
This isn't us going into our type of group hug. Let's talk about everybody at the table enjoying themselves as a collective. This is oh no, you, my opponent, have broken the social contract. So now I'm going to break the social contract right back with you. Which,
these are,
frankly, that's understandable. We've all had that experience. We've all had that player that sits down and just decides no one is going to have fun except them.
Right.
And this is a very good way of making that person have the least amount of fun possible. So with that said, let's go ahead and why don't we start with our vegetables? You mentioned Academy Ruins is the win con, or one of the win cons of this deck.
Right.
So let's talk about that synergy a little bit later. What lands do you want to start with, Alex?
Sure, Mike. Well, we're running a nice variety of lands here. I don't tend to like to run very many basics in a 3 or more color deck. So as you can see, we're running got 2 islands, 1 mountain, and 1 plains. Those are my only basics. And then we have a lot of dual and rainbow lands.
Yeah.
But then we also have some utility lands. So we don't talk about Academy Ruins. We'll talk about that later. Let's talk about a new member of the family here, Axgard Armory. This one just got printed in Kaldheim.
Yep.
And Mike, this is the exact kind of utility land that this deck loves. Axgard Armory is a land that enters the battlefield tapped and has tap add white. It also has pay 1 red, white, tap, and sacrifice. Search your library for an aura card and or an equipment card. Reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. So, Mike, you can get 2 cards with this land.
Yeah. It is a favorite of mine in a lot of my decks. I run a lot of equipment. I love my Enchantress type of decks, and Axguard Armory is really good.
Yeah, you'll find that this deck loves auras because auras target specific things as opposed to global enchantments, which affect the whole board. I have plenty of those too, but being able to fetch out an aura, most of my super oppressive cards are going to be auras, so that's a good one to have. Speaking of getting back enchantments, Hall of Heliod's Generosity.
Yep.
This is just another entry in the Academy Ruin cycle. Legendary land with tap, add a colorless, and 1 white and tap. Put target enchantment card from your graveyard on top of your library. Mike, this is just perfect. This is just perfect. I mean, this is exactly what I want to be doing. Academy Ruins is the same thing, but with artifacts. These pieces are very oppressive to one player, or maybe more than one player, incidentally.
Depending
but
on
the
what you're
fact of the matter is that they're going to draw removal. People do not want to be affected. We'll talk about some of these. You'll be like, wow, I would want to remove that. And you're right. People are going to remove them. That's why we need these recursion lands that can get these cards back on top of my library so I can cast them again. But they also function as win cons, which we'll talk about later. How about Undo Sky Ruins? This is a modal double-faced land spell card that got printed in Zendikar. And on the land side, which is the back face, it says Undo Sky Ruins ETBs tapped, and you add a white with tap. Then on the front face is a sorcery spell, Undo Inversion, for 6 white, destroy all non-land permanents. Now, that's a really expensive sorcery.
Absolutely.
However, just for me personally, these modal double-faced cards with a land on one half are lands. Yeah. Now, they're tap lands, so you need to keep that in mind, but they're lands. So I did not have to cut a spell for this. I cut a land for this.
Sure. There has to be some kind of... When we talked about something being a little bit more expensive because it has different modes or because it's more variable, that increases furthermore. I love these flip land, or not flip lands rather, but the modal double face lands. Yeah. Because the worst case scenario is it's a tap land.
Right.
If it needs to be, and like again, 8 mana for a board wipe is a lot.
But the opportunity cost is so low of including it in your deck.
Yep.
And if you draw it in your opening hand, you're not like, oh my god, I can't believe I drew an 8 mana value spell in my opening hand. Well, you can just cast it as a land on turn 1 when you don't have a 1-drop, and you don't even lose tempo. Like, normally I do not, Mike, you know me, I do not like tap lands, but when a tap land has so much upside that it's literally a spell that has a board wipe, which is exactly what this deck wants to be doing.
For sure.
It's just a good include for me. Likewise, we have another one, and that is Seagate Reborn, which on the land side, which is the back, and just for reference, when it's a modal double-faced card and the land is on the back, you can't tutor out the land, because when it's in your library, it's the instant or sorcery face, the front face. All right, so let's keep that in mind. Seagate Reborn on the back. When Seagate Reborn enters the battlefield, you may pay 3 life. If you don't, it ETB's tapped. And then it has tap at a blue. Now, this is the mythic cycle of MDFC lands, so rather than being a strictly tap land, it's a bolt land. You can pay 3 life at ETB's untapped. But let's look at why I have this card, and that's Seagate Restoration on the front face. 4 triple blue, 7 mana for a sorcery. Draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. You have no max hand size for the rest of the game.
Yep.
That's just a nice ace in the hole to have.
It really is. Just when you talk about the value of trying to... How much mana am I getting for how many cards? You don't have to work too hard for this to get a good amount of value, especially when you consider the fact that having no max hand size for the rest of the game, maybe that doesn't mean a lot in a bunch of other decks.
In a control stacks deck?
In a control stacks deck?
Yes. Holding it up.
All of the
hold
options.
Up all those answers. You just want to have as many different answers as you can possibly have in this deck.
Or at the very least, you want to be able to influence the table that you have more answers than you should.
Mm-hmm.
And that always works out nicely.
Now, this one may strike people as an odd include. Petrified Field.
Okay.
Because this is not a lands deck, and you usually would only see Petrified Field in a lands deck.
Mm-hmm.
Petrified Field is a land with tap, add a colorless, and tap, sacrifice Petrified Field. Return target land card from your graveyard to your hand. And Mike, specifically the reason for that is as an insurance policy, because this deck truly only has 2 win cons, and realistically speaking, they both involve lands for part of the lock. So if somebody gets sneaky and destroys one of my lands, as people would like to do, especially Academy Ruins,
as people might,
people may want to do that, and if they do, and I don't have a means to get that land out of the graveyard, that's half or both of my main win cons are gone. This land, Petrified Field, will help avoid that situation and get back those lands in case of emergency.
I dig it.
Yeah,
I dig it a lot. So the land base, again, you've got some basics in there. A lot of the rainbow lands, if you called them, a lot of lands.
We didn't talk about all the different fixing lands, but we'll have the deck list, and you can read what I've chosen. Lots of shock lands, rainbow lands. We have Cascading Cataracts as a fixing land. Specifically, when we talk about Kykar, you'll see why I'm running this. Indestructible, tap, add colorless, and it also has pay 5, tap, add 5 mana in any combination of colors. Mm-hmm. So that's relevant for Kykar specifically, because Kykar only makes 1 type of mana. Want to go ahead and read off Kykar right now? Let's do that.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and read off Kykar, and you can tell me why Kykar is the commander of this deck.
Absolutely. I'll also give you a bit of a mini history lesson
for
this deck. Kykar Wind's Fury for 1 blue, red, white, legendary creature, bird wizard. It's a 3/3 with flying. And it says, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. And he also has sacrifice a spirit at red. So basically, what's happening is you're going to make a token every time you cast a non-creature spell. And those tokens, as long as Kykar's out, are always able to be converted to a single red mana at instant speed, which is phenomenal. This is a very generic commander, generic meaning it can fit a lot of different archetypes.
Sure.
As long as that archetype is primarily non-creature, which makes sense because this is Jeskai. Jeskai doesn't like creature spells, it likes token creatures. So this is in service to getting out stacks pieces faster and specifically building up a wall of flying blockers to ward off aggression. So let's go ahead and move on to the category Mike wants to do next.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to see your card advantage category here because we talked a little bit about them with the land, with Axe Guard, Armory, and we talked about it with Seagate Restoration, but especially in a control deck, in a stacks deck, you want to have as many options in hand as possible. So why don't we talk about some of those?
Mm-hmm. Now, Mike, you know me, and when I am playing card draw spells, which is the first kind of card advantage we'll talk about, I like to get a lot of value for not a lot of mana. Mm-hmm. So the first card I want to talk about here is Dig Through Time.
Yeah.
Which is banned in a lot of formats. 6 blue for an instant with Delve. Delve is a keyword that says each card you exile from your graveyard while casting the spell pays for 1. So if you were to exile 6 from your graveyard, you would pay blue. Mm-hmm. And it says, look at the top 7 cards of your library. Put 2 of them into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. So you're going to dig 7 deep and draw 2 for as little as 2 mana at instant speed. There's a reason this card is banned in a bunch of formats, Mike.
It's real gross. It's real gross. Because no one ever cast Dig Through Time for 8 mana.
No, never. Never. And this deck specifically will tend to accrue things in the graveyard because, for example, if I'm putting an aura on a creature and that creature dies, aura goes to the graveyard. If I put it on a player and they remove it, aura goes to the graveyard.
You're going to play a lot of...
go to the graveyard. Yeah.
You're going to play a lot of things that people want to have gone.
Exactly.
Or are instant or sorcery.
Exactly. And this deck does have recursion, as you've seen for artifacts and enchantments and, to a lesser extent, lands. But instants and sorceries, I don't have recursion for, so I'm totally fine with exiling those right out of my graveyard and drawing some more cards. And specifically, the reason why Dig Through Time, for me, is the preferable one to Treasure Cruise, which I also love. Number 1, Dig Through Time is an instant, which is great. But number 2, specifically with Dig Through Time, you dig 7 deep. And with this deck, we're all about finding the right answer at the right time. Yes. So digging is going to help us find those answers.
Makes sense. What else you got for me?
Let's see what else we got. How about one of my favorites, Mystic Remora. Mystic Remora, simply a classic card draw effect in blue for not a lot of mana, and that's what I like. Let's go ahead and read this off. Mystic Remora for a single blue, an enchantment with cumulative upkeep 1. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. So they really don't want to pay the 4, Mike. They basically never do. Cumulative upkeep real quick. At the beginning of your upkeep, as long as this permanent is on the battlefield under your control, you will either sacrifice it or put an age counter on it and then pay its upkeep for each age counter you have. So the first turn will cost 1, then 2, then 3.
Mm-hmm. It's, I mean, we peek behind the curtain. Rhystic Study is also in this deck. But
oh, yes. Yeah.
It's a sometimes better Rhystic Study, depending on what you're trying to do, depending on how far in the game you are. It
depends on the types of spells that your opponents cast.
Correct.
If you're playing against a bunch of Timmies who love to just drop creatures all the time, probably not the best effect, but pretty much the more competitive your meta is, the better Rhystic Remora becomes.
Yes. Because
you can play this really early as you think your meta is able to handle, and there are some metas where you're playing like you're almost guaranteed to see mana rocks on turn 2, if not turn 1, with fast mana. So if you're putting this down and you're in the kind of meta where people are putting down fast mana rocks, nobody's going to not put down their fast mana rock. They have to, and no one's going to pay the 4 because they can't. So you can get a lot of card draw before you ever have to pay the cumulative upkeep cost, as long as you put this down at the right time, Mike.
I wish this card had a different name. Because the problem is,
it sounds like a creature.
It is a creature. Remora is a fish.
I know
the card art is a fish.
Yes.
Why is it an enchantment?
We'll figure it out one day.
We won't, but that's okay. What else you got for me? Let's distract from it.
Sure. So here's perhaps the best card draw effect in the deck. And if you play a deck with tokens in it, you probably already know what I'm going to say, and that's Skull Clamp.
Mm-hmm.
Skull Clamp is an artifact equipment for 1 mana that says equipped creature gets +1/-1, and whenever equipped creature dies, draw 2 cards with equip 1. Anyone who's ever played a token deck or a lean deck with a lot of low toughness creatures, especially toughness 1.
Right.
This card is, I mean, what do you even say about it, Mike? This is easily one of the best cards in the entire format. It was never meant to be this strong. It got banned because it was so strong in other formats. Yeah. The fact of the matter is that as long as you have a token that's a 1/1 or something else that's 1/1, and you pay 1 mana, you will draw 2 cards. And that is an incredibly powerful effect, Mike.
Can you imagine how much worse this card would be if it was just equipped creature gets +1/+0?
That's what it was. It was supposed to be +1/+1. They thought that would be too strong.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oops.
Now, don't get me wrong. This would still be playable in most token decks as long as you ran a sack outlet with it.
Sure.
But it wouldn't be anywhere near as strong as it is right now.
Instead of it just being amazing, it would be amazing if you had the other pieces. And if you don't have the other pieces, then it's just good.
If you were wondering what equipment I was going to go get with X-Guard Armory, it's this. This is what I'm going to go find. All right. So those are some of the normal card draw effects, but there are other kinds of card advantage, Mike. For example, like tutoring. Now, tutoring is a very, very powerful effect that makes your deck more consistent and more likely to win.
Mhm.
Now, that's not typically the angle that I like to go for in my decks. I typically don't like to have a consistent deck. That being said, because this deck is specifically a toolbox stacks deck, it functions a lot better when I'm able to find the specific stacks pieces that I need to find.
Sure.
So that's why this deck is running a few tutors here, starting with Idyllic Tutor.
Mm-hmm.
Idyllic Tutor is a sorcery for 2 and a white. Search your library for an enchantment card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle. This is just the second best white tutor, right? And the first best is, of course, going to be Enlightened Tutor, which is way more expensive. It's like 5 times as expensive.
For good reason.
It's clearly the better tutor. For a single white mana, it's an instant. Search your library for an artifact or enchantment card, reveal it, shuffle your library, and put that card on top. This is probably the best turn 1 play the deck has.
Yep.
Because I'm consider myself experienced enough in the game of Commander to understand when I see an opponent's deck and vaguely understand what archetype of deck that is, what card out of our hate list, which we'll go over in a few minutes here, would be the best hoser for them. So I can just go find that right away. And it doesn't matter if they know it's coming.
Yeah, there's that.
Yeah.
There's also worst case scenario if it's a turn 1 pass, then on your opponent's end step, cast it, go find a Soul Ring, put it on top. Oh no. Yeah. That's terrible. Turn 2 Soul Rings, gross.
Yeah.
Why don't you give me 2 more cards before we move on to the next segment here?
Sure. So let's talk about one more weird tutor that you may not have seen, and then we'll talk about one more card after that. The weird tutor is Wild Research.
Yeah.
Now, I feel like before the list came out, most people had never seen this card before, because this card got printed in Mystery Boosters. But before that, it was printed in like Odyssey. Like, this card is just not common. It's this is a Naya spell, Wild Research, for 2 and a red. It's an enchantment with 2 activated abilities. The first one is pay 1 and a white, search your library for an enchantment card, and reveal that card. Put it into your hand, discard a card at random, then shuffle. And it has the exact same second ability for 1 and a blue, except it's an instant instead of an enchantment.
Repeated gamble, but
yeah, it's just
weird.
Gamble. You don't have to tap the enchantment.
Nope.
And I have absolutely been burned by this. Of course I have, because it's a gamble. But the fact of the matter is that if you screw up and discard the card that you wanted to find or another one of your hate pieces, I have the lens to help you go get those out of the graveyard. So we're going to be okay.
That's fair.
The last one, and one that will transition us smoothly into our main category here.
Yeah.
Into our main category here is Psychic Possession. This is both a card draw effect, card advantage, and a hate spell. So let's read it here. Psychic Possession is a 2 blue enchantment aura with enchant opponents. And the first effect says skip your draw step. That's not usually a great start.
No.
However, you know we're going to get something good, and we do. Whenever enchanted opponent draws a card, you may draw a card. Now, this is basically just a less broken, nicer version of... gosh, Mike, what's the Sphinx that draws a ton of cards?
Consecrated Sphinx.
Consecrated Sphinx, thank you. This is just a nicer, less broken Consecrated Sphinx. And the fact of the matter is that even though you do skip your draw step, the downside is very minimal. The absolute worst case scenario is that your opponent never draws any cards, which is pretty good for you. They will draw a card on their draw step. But other than that, if they just choose not to draw any cards to not give you any extra cards, that's fine by you, because no matter what, they draw that card on their draw step and you will also draw a card. So even though you skip your draw step, no matter what your opponent does, you are never down cards.
It's a very good card as far as taking advantage of those that are going to try and find all of their answers or dig through their deck and all that good stuff. It's also one that I've tried to make work 1,000 times through things like Zedru, and just like, no, I'm going to make somebody else take it.
Speaking of Zedru, that's an excellent segue. Before we get into the hate section, you asked why Kykar was specifically the commander. The commander used to be Zedru before Kykar came out, and the deck used to focus more around donating negative effects to the player in question. However, Zedru, I just found, was not really conducive to what I wanted to be doing with this deck. Zedru absolutely can work in this capacity, and the best way I found that it works is by donating auras, because you can fix your deck and build it to the specific way such that you would curse someone, donate the aura to them, but it's not the kind of curse that would benefit them to control it.
Yes.
That said, it was very limiting in the kinds of hate cards that it truly benefited from playing. And also, I noticed that I was running very few hate bears, really like 5 in the whole deck. And those were my only creatures. So really all I had to do to transition it was remove the few creatures that were in the deck, because Kykar doesn't like creatures, and then remove the donation effects in the deck, of which I honestly had found that I'd been slowly removing over the course of time anyway. Zedru is just a very slow and gradual commander. It costs a lot of mana to donate effects and cast spells in the same turn.
Yeah, and that's a little bit harder
just
to
way
pull
later.
off in Jeskai.
Yeah.
Which makes sense. So
Kykar's just getting me the ramp just on the commander, getting me the creatures. It's just a great effect.
And I mean, you took out some hate bears, but there's still, I'm looking at the list, plenty of hate in the deck. So why don't we go ahead and move on to the hate? Why don't you start us off at the top here? What kind of hate should we expect if Alex's Kykar deck hits the table?
Now, the important thing to keep in mind here for the hate section before we get started is that this hate package, we'll call it, has been tailored to my personal meta that I play with. And your hit package, if you were to create this deck or one like it, would necessarily probably be pretty different from mine. So if you're hearing about one of these cards like, I don't know why he's running that card, nobody plays that archetype in my meta, well, got a great answer for you. There's pretty much a stack silver bullet for every kind of deck archetype.
And lots of ways to try and find it specifically.
Exactly. And we're not going to go over every deck archetype, but we are going to go over each individual hate piece and talk about what kind of decks they hose. Now, we already talked about Psychic Possession, which is going to hose blue decks and black decks especially that really like to draw cards. But let's talk about an even more generic effect than that just really hoses a ton of decks. How about Nevermore?
Yeah.
Nevermore is an enchantment for 1 white that says, as Nevermore enters the battlefield, name a non-land card. The named card can't be cast. Now,
so rough.
This is a really easy one to pick. I'm going to pick the commander of the player who's playing the too powerful of a commander.
Yep.
I'm going to name Urza. I'm going to name Keurig. I'm going to name all the most powerful commanders. If you have one, I'm going to name it, and now you can't cast your commander. If it's already out, it'll remain out until it's removed. But basically, the only commanders that this can't hose are Derevi, the bird wizard, and Yumiko, the blue-black ninja. Other than that,
cast. Yeah,
because they're not cast. They're just put onto the battlefield, and also any effect that would put your commander out of the battlefield. But 99.99% of commanders have to be cast to get out of the battlefield. So this is going to hose all of them. Yep.
That makes sense.
And what's nice is that unlike that hate bear that we talked about recently, Mike, that prevents anyone from casting their commander, this is only hosing one player. So everyone else can still cast their commanders, and we don't have a problem there.
Sure. What else you got for me?
This is an interesting one that's, I think people wouldn't usually think of as a hate piece, and we've talked about it before, Mike. That's Angel's Grace.
Yeah.
This is just one of my favorite white spells. You know I like white spells that are 1 mana instants that just do super impactful things, and this is certainly that. Angel's Grace for white. It's an instant with split second. As long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. And the effect says, you can't lose the game this turn and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead. Now, this is just a general ace in the hole style card, but the specific effect that I want to talk about here is your opponents can't win the game this turn.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, this effect hoses alternate win cons. There are a lot of really powerful alternate win cons in this game.
Yeah.
That's, we have to talk about the number one such win con because this hoses it way more than usual. We're talking about Laboratory Maniac, Thassa's Oracle, and Jace. Now, for any of those, but especially Jace and Labman, if you're if you have Labman on the field and you have the effect to mill yourself out or draw yourself out on the stack, and I cast Angel's Grace, unless you can figure out a way to avoid, there's like, what are you even going to do? There's nothing you can do. So
there's split second on Angel's Grace.
It's split second. So after Angel's Grace resolves, basically you have to figure something out to avoid drawing your deck, because what's going to happen is you'll draw the whole deck. Labman will try to say that you win, but you can't, so you'll lose. So this absolutely hard counters Laboratory Maniac, which is the number one alternate win con in our format.
So here's our second half of Judge's Corner.
Judge.
So because I thought I understood that, and I'm glad I did the way that I'm supposed to. How does that work with something in a deck archetype that I do a lot, like commander damage? Say I were to attack you.
Yeah.
And I hit you with enough commander damage to where you're at 21 commander damage or over. Does Angel's Grace care? You don't lose that turn, but then, okay, we pass the turn. Do you then lose on the next turn because you're at 21 commander damage?
So, to my understanding, Mike, that is a good question, because losing the game due to having 21 or more commander damage from a single commander marked on you is a state-based action.
Okay.
State-based actions will check themselves and resolve themselves whenever they're allowed to, which is basically all the time that something else isn't resolving. Now, just like any other thing that's going to check as many times as the state-based action will check, it isn't going to stop checking. So the state-based action will look to see if you have 21 more commander damage marked.
Sure.
It'll see that you do. It'll say you lose the game, but you can't. And goodness, I probably should have looked this up before I started. My understanding should be that's because state-based actions. You sprung one on me. So state-based actions.
It's a weird question. I apologize.
It is a weird question. The question is whether basically it would go to the next turn or it would be a draw. Because I think that it would end up being a draw, because each time that state-based action checks and resolves and then basically fails to make you lose the game, that state-based action is going to check again, because state-based actions will continue to check. One of the times that state-based actions are allowed to be checked is right after a state-based action finishes resolving. So it's going to check again. It's going to notice that you have 21 commander damage marked again, and it's going to try to make you lose the game again. And this will never stop.
Right.
So my judge ruling, and it's funny, I've never thought about this before. My judge ruling would be that the game would be a stalemate, because
that's so weird. Because you wouldn't be.
You've caused a loop that neither player can break.
That's so silly. I dig it. Well, the card was weird before. Why don't you go ahead and tell me about our next hate piece?
Sure. Now, Mike, one of the more oppressive kinds of decks, when people talk about oppressive decks, one name that pops up all the time is Brago, King Eternal.
Mm-hmm.
And Brago is a creature that says basically flying, and whenever he deals combat damage to an opponent, Brago's controller can blink any number of non-land permanents that player controls which is to exile them and return them to the battlefield, and basically just get a ton of free ETBs, untap all their mana rocks. Like, they just get a ton of value off of it. How can we stop this blinking menace? Well, Mike, that's with Torpor Orb.
Yep.
Torpor Orb is a 2-mana artifact that says creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. It's not going to get everything, but some of the stronger ETB effects tend to be on creatures, and blinking creatures is a great way to get those ETB effects. So Torpor Orb is just going to completely stop that from happening. But we also have another option for creatures that are entering the battlefield, but they aren't entering from being properly cast. Mm-hmm. And this is a little bit harsher of a punishment. Containment Priest. It's a classic hate bear. This is a 2/2 for 1 and a white. Creature human cleric with flash. If a non-token creature would ETB and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. This is basically saying no reanimating without paying your mana cost, no basically cheating it out from your hand without casting it, no cheating it out from the command zone without casting it, and no blinking either. You can't exile it and have it return to the battlefield.
No valuing out creatures.
Right, exactly. You need to play fair and pay for your effects when Containment Priest is out. And Containment Priest can be a surprise because she has flash. Mm-hmm. What's relevant here, there was recently a commander rules change, and this one is probably not even that interesting to anyone but a judge, but it does involve Containment Priest. And basically the way it worked is due to the 2020 change for the command zone replacement effect, which previously worked in such a way that if your commander would die or be exiled, it would instead move to the command zone. That's now changed, and now it says if your commander dies or is exiled, and this is it has entered that zone since the last time state-based actions were checked, its owner may move it to the command zone, so you can still get your triggers. However, that did have another effect that not a lot of people realized, and that is that if you blink your commander, and Containment Priest was to prevent it from re-entering the battlefield by exiling it, and it was already in exile prior to this rules change, which I don't even remember when this happened, I think earlier in 2021. Prior to this rules change, if your commander was in exile and then was exiled again, well, that just counts as remaining in exile, or it used to count as that. So the effect was that because your commander had been in exile since the last time state-based actions were checked, and you didn't move it to the command zone because you thought you were going to blink it and get it back to the battlefield, well, in that case, your commander was permanently exiled, and it's never coming back.
Which is a problem.
That is a problem. So they did change it. That's not how it works anymore. The way that it works now is such that if your commander is in exile and then gets exiled again, like with Containment Priest, you'll have a new option to move it to the command zone as a state-based action. That was a really granular, probably unnecessary tangent, but I mean, if you're playing Containment Priest, you might as well know how it works, right?
Oh, no. And also, we should absolutely, on our podcast, talk about the things that were unnecessary while we do it.
Absolutely.
But that's just stacks.
You may remember the command zone was worried about Rune for a while because Rune could do the same trick with basically blinking your commander and forcing a gambit. And the gambit is, do I think the Rune player has something that would prevent my commander from coming back? For example, a stifle, because Rune blinking the commander back in is a triggered ability, a delayed trigger. So if they were able to stifle it or flash out a Containment Priest, then your commander would just be stuck in exile forever. So the gambit is that if you want to play it safe, you have to put your commander back in the command zone. But it could have just been the case that they weren't going to stifle it, and now you have to recast your commander. So that was a really negative situation. I thought it could have interesting effects, but realistically speaking, Rune's ability is so easy to just exile commanders one after the other. It makes sense that they changed it, Mike.
It's reasonable. I'm glad.
Do you have any questions about that? Did that make sense to you?
Yeah, it made sense.
Okay.
I followed through
Great.
before because I got real scared. I like Command Zone. I got very scared.
Yeah, there was a bit of
ruining bunch
a
other cards,
panic when that real change happened, and
but
Command
they
Zone's like,
resolved it. I
man,
appreciate
Command Zone's like, if you see someone playing Rune, oh buddy,
Run.
yeah. Our next hate piece here is Stranglehold.
Mm-hmm.
Great hit piece. 3 in a red for an enchantment. Your opponents can't search libraries. We know how powerful that effect is.
Yep.
But as a bonus, we also have if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. So
Just
this is going to
real
hose
solid.
extra turn decks and decks that are very high power and like to tutor a bunch of cards.
Mm-hmm.
Going to get both of them.
Always nice to turn off some of the more synergistic combo-y things that you can do.
Absolutely. Our next one here, War's Toll.
Mm-hmm.
And this one's here to hose control decks, especially permission decks and decks that like to hold up mana.
Yes.
War's Toll is 3 in a red again for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, tap all lands that player controls. Now that is a trigger, so they have the option to tap them in response and pay. But what they don't have the option to do is leave lands untapped so that they can counterspell you later, because that's it. Their second ability is if a creature an opponent controls attacks, all creatures that opponent controls attack if able. Yep. This also helps with control decks because control decks tend to have utility creatures and maybe some unblockable creatures to get in for a damage trigger. Mm-hmm. But what this says is that if you're going to try to sneak in some damage for a trigger, that's really inadvisable because now all your utility creatures are up for grabs. I'm going to be able to kill any of them that I want to.
Yep.
It really just slows that down. It makes people not want to attack unless they're an aggro deck. And the first ability, of course, is specifically stopping control decks from holding up mana to do counter spells and flash things out, things like that.
Makes sense. What else do you want to talk about in the hate pieces?
Okay. This is the splashiest effect in the deck, I think. Whenever this hits the board, everyone's kind of like, ooh, Overwhelming Splendor.
Yeah.
This is 6 white for an enchantment or a curse with enchant player. Creatures enchanted player controls lose all abilities and have base power and toughness 1/1. That's humility.
Uh-huh.
Enchanted player can't activate abilities that aren't mana abilities or loyalty abilities. And that's what's her name? Linvala.
Yeah.
Keeper of Silence. So we've got 2 major hosers for a creature deck specifically, especially big aggro decks that make big creatures, and control decks, also decks that have utility creatures. This is just going to make all of your creatures, unless you're a token deck, this is hosing your creature deck. It's not going to work anymore. Creature activated abilities don't work. Your artifact activated abilities that aren't mana rocks don't work. Really hoses.
It turns off a lot. I mean, I was about to say, like, it turns off this, it turns off a lot of things, and it's definitely it can be just a game ender for somebody. It's a very good card.
And let's talk about Confounding Conundrum.
Yeah.
Which is 1 in a blue for an enchantment. When Confounding Conundrum enters the battlefield, draw a card. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. So this is going to hose most kinds of lands decks. Now they're still going to get their landfall triggers, but it's a lot better for them to get only landfall triggers instead of landfall triggers, and also now they have a ton of mana available.
Right.
The actual tools, Mike, that we have for hating on lands and land ramp decks are surprisingly limited.
Yeah,
and this is one of the only ones.
But
well, that's the thing is land destruction is a great option, but not in this specific way. You'd be surprised. No. What I've found is that land decks, specifically land decks with green, because what kind of land deck doesn't have green, when you do mass land destruction, that land deck is going to be able to recover the fastest, specifically because land decks, the vast majority of them, have ways to play lands out of their graveyard and also to reanimate lands for free. So land destruction is a viable strategy in some cases, but not really in my experience to hose land decks. You need a land ramp hate effect like Confounding Conundrum.
It's a good time. And when I say it's a good time, I mean it's a good time for people that aren't me, because I love my Damian deck, and Confounded Conundrum makes it very, very sad.
The last one I'll talk about, and
Sure.
and again, there are more, and you can look at our
Mm-hmm.
at my deck list here, and also add your own hit pieces for your meta. Last one here, the Immortal Sun.
Yeah.
For 6 mana, legendary artifact. Players can't activate Planeswalker loyalty abilities. I think you know what kind of deck this is meant to hose. That's Super Friends.
Yep.
At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And creatures you control get +1/+1. So there's a lot of value on this card, but really I'm here for the first ability. Yep. And that is to completely and utterly put the brakes on any Planeswalker deck.
What were you trying to... No. What were you trying... No. That's kind of what this deck does.
No, you weren't.
There is some hate on it, but again, it's very specific hate, which is the interesting part of the deck itself.
Like, sure, this will prevent your deck that has a couple of Planeswalkers from using them, but your deck's still going to work. I'm not making your deck actively worse. However, the player across from you is screwed.
I feel like this deck is like the wrapping a ruler on somebody's knuckles for not behaving.
This is the Nun deck.
Yeah, the Nun deck.
Yeah.
What are you doing? None.
I
like it. Well, I'll tell you what. We're gonna take a quick break here. I'm going to pop my knuckles because I'm starting to get a little bit worried here, and then we're going to come back with a couple of other aspects of the deck, including the ramp, how it protects itself, and I mean, eventually, how it wins, and going more into detail on that effect. All right, we're back, and let's go into the ramp. And frankly, I hate to say it, it's Jeskai. So there's a lot of rocks in here.
Options.
Yeah, there's a lot of rocks in here because that's what you've got to work with. But because of Kykar and the colors that you get in Jeskai, you do have a couple of other abilities and cards that are available to you. Why don't we go through a couple of those real quick, Alex?
Yeah, well, I guess the first one I want to talk about, Mike, is Kykar itself.
Yeah.
Kykar is a ramp effect because as long as I'm casting spells, Kykar is basically making me the equivalent of treasures that I can save for spending on future spells. And it allows me to get out more hit pieces faster and really ramp forward. And the best effect about it is that if Kykar is about to be removed, I can, in response, sack all of my spirits and get a bunch of mana and cast a quick spell with it so that it doesn't go to waste.
Sure. It's conditional ramp, but it's the thing that the deck is doing all the time, so it's not that conditional.
Right. This deck is, what do I think? I have 3 creatures, including Kykar, in the deck, and the rest are non-creature spells and lands. The deck is very specifically crafted to constantly be triggering Kykar.
Yep.
Yeah. So,
good.
Kykar's ability is pretty close to Phyrexian Altar. You sacrifice a creature and get a colored mana. But we also have Ashnod's Altar, Mike, which this is not a reanimation or aristocrats deck or even really a proper token deck. But the fact of the matter is that as long as Kykar's out and making spirits, sometimes you just want to have 2 colorless mana instead of a red mana, and that's a great option for it. Now, specifically because Kykar only makes spirits, we're able to run an effect that typically you would only see in a tribal deck, and it's a very powerful piece of ramp. And that's Mana Echoes. Mana Echoes is 2 red for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, you may add an amount of colorless mana equal to the number of creatures you control that share a creature type with it.
Yep.
And it's always worth mentioning that it counts itself.
Yes.
So no matter what, bare minimum, you are going to instantly make a mana when a spirit enters. So with this and Kykar out, when I cast a spell, I've basically immediately added red colorless to my mana pool.
Yes.
Which is... And that's the bare minimum. The next one I cast, I'll add red double colorless, and the next one, red triple colorless. It's so much mana, Mike, and again, typically this is only run in tribal decks, but because Kykar works this way, it actually works fantastically well.
It compounds quickly, especially
Yes.
if you have a token doubler, which is pretty effective in this deck.
And I do happen to have a token doubler, and I count this as ramp because of Kykar.
What it does. Yeah.
Anointed Procession. 3 and a white for an enchantment. If an effect would create one or more tokens under your control, it creates twice that many tokens instead. So now all my spells are paying 2 spirits, cashing out 4 double red. Phenomenal. Absolutely.
It's a good amount of
Great
value.
effect.
Even all of those by themselves is a good amount of value, but the ability to synergize, Kykar has this very flexible ability, which you've done a pretty good job taking advantage of.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about you protecting yourself, especially if you're going to be playing a deck that is very, very insistent on making one person very, very upset. Well, you got to have some ways to stop bad things from happening to you as a result of that. So,
Absolutely.
What are some of the Pillow 40 effects that you've got in the deck?
Yeah, so we've already talked about Academy of Ruins, Hall of Heliod's Generosity, which get back permanents from the graveyard. And we've talked about Angel's Grace, which basically is a one-time, I don't lose the game this turn effect. Great pillow fort. And we talked about Petrified Field, which protects my lands from the graveyard as well. But we also have a couple of effects to protect Kykar, because as I'm sure you've noticed, I've been talking about assuming Kykar has been on the battlefield a lot. And that's not a great assumption to make unless you can protect them.
People want to get rid of commanders.
We probably can try. So the first way we would try to do that is with Gift of Immortality.
Yep.
Which is a white aura for 2 and a white with enchant creature. When enchanted creature dies, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Then return Gift to the Immortality to the battlefield attached to that creature at the beginning of the next end step. Mike, it is really discouraging for people who want to do spot removal or board wipes, knowing that they have to blow 2 spells, either targeting the aura and my commander or my commander twice.
Yep.
To actually get it off the field. That people don't want to have to do that.
It's not just people don't want to have to do that. It's having both of those types of resources available and being able to hit them up and sync them one and then the other right after. That's difficult.
And you would think that in most scenarios, the table together could amalgamate multiple removal spells between the 3 of them. However, with this deck, the player that I'm preying upon, I'm also counting on them not having any friends in the rest of the table because they're playing an oppressive deck, or so we believe.
More times than not, at the very least.
Yes.
What else you got for me?
Well, the other way I'm going to protect is with Vanishing. Now, this card totally flies under the radar. This is easily one of my favorite Pillow Fort effects. Vanishing is a single blue mana for an enchant creature aura. And it has a single activated ability, pay blue, enchanted creature phases out. This effect, it's the single most powerful Pillow Fort effect. When something is phased out, it's treated as though it does not exist.
Yep.
Removal doesn't hit it. Spot removal doesn't hit it. Wraths don't hit it. -X doesn't hit it. Exile doesn't hit it. Tuck doesn't hit it. Literally nothing can touch your commander while it's phased out. You might be wondering, if you're not too familiar with phasing, you might think, oh, well, it phases out Kykar, but what about itself? Isn't someone just going to blow that up? Well, you'd be wrong, because there's indirect phasing out. Whenever a permanent phases out, all permanents that are attached to that permanent also phase out. And then they will all phase back in at the beginning of my next untap step.
Hey, we're back.
So, Mike, this is a counterspell that I have at all times that says, do not try to remove my commander. It will not work.
Sure. Well, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about, if somebody wanted to not just remove your commander, or just they wanted to remove whatever. What's a good way to discourage them from trying to destroy anything that you want?
Well, we have a couple of options here. You can start with Karmic Justice.
Yeah, that's
Classic.
what I was getting at.
Yep. Karmic Justice, 2 and a white for an enchantment. Whenever a spell or ability an opponent controls destroys a non-creature permanent you control, that's most of my permanents, you may destroy target permanent that opponent controls. Now, let's read that again. When an opponent destroys a non-creature permanent, I can destroy any permanent that player controls.
Yep.
So, if they cut me, I'm going to cut off one of their legs. I'm going to take out either their best land. I can take out their biggest mana rock. I have my pick of the litter. They are heavily discouraged from removing my stuff because I'm going to strike back and take their best thing.
Another piece that makes it harder for them to remove the auras that you put on them,
Exactly.
et cetera.
Exactly. Yeah. They really get crackback automatically from this. And
it's very
even
good.
if they try to remove this, they're still going to get hit.
Yep. Even if this is a 3 mana, I have to get rid of that.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's still a 3 mana. I'm going to get rid of your best thing.
Exactly. But, Mike, we also have another Pillar Fort option. We were just talking about phasing, and this is the absolute ultimate Pillar Fort, ultimate phasing card, Teferi's Protection.
Yep.
Perhaps the best white spell in the game? Question mark? Maybe. Teferi's Protection,
probably.
2 and a white for an instant. Until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out and exile Teferi's Protection. Mike, those are 3 very powerful things. Life total can't change.
Yep.
That's only on Platinum Empyrean in this card. There's only 2 cards in the game. Platinum Empyrean's a big artifact boy. It costs a lot of mana. This costs 3 mana. Second thing, protection from everything. The only thing that I can think of with protection from everything is Progenitus, which gives it to a creature, and Teferi's Protection, which costs 7 mana less and also affects you.
Mm-hmm.
And then the third thing, all permanents you control phase out. That means no board wipes. That means no spot removal. All of the things that I said that Vanishing protects my commander from, Teferi's Protection protects everything from.
Yep.
This is the single most versatile Pillar Fort effect that will protect you from almost anything. The only things that it won't protect you from are hand attack, when somebody makes everyone discard their hand, and mill, if someone makes everyone mill. Because those effects, if they don't target, you don't have protection from them.
Right.
And your library and hand and graveyard are not phased out. So those are the only things that anyone can do to you. Literally every other strategy is non-functional. This card is, it's just the best of the best.
It's the best white spell.
Yeah.
I mean, like, we can talk about how, Path to Exile, Swords, those are very good. And
right.
Sure. They are the best, right? As far as what they do. The upside on Teferi's Protection is you win the game. The lowest that Teferi's Protection does is it keeps you from losing the game.
Right.
Like, it's a good card.
You can use it aggressively, defensively. You can threaten with it. Like, there's basically nothing that can be done except countering Teferi's Protection.
If the only thing against it is that it can be countered, well, then it's only like 90% of all spells in Magic, but with the upside of being the best.
Right.
So those are the ways that you can defend yourself, and you can defend Kykar, which are very important for this deck. What are some of the ways that you can get rid of some of the imminent threats? We already mentioned one of them with Path to Exile. Not quite the best white spell in the game, but definitely in the running.
It's way up there.
Absolutely.
Probably top 5.
What are some of the other things that you can do, though?
All right. So Path to Exile is definitely a great one, but Mike, we need a wide variety of different kinds of removal spells to deal with a wide different variety of decks.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't we start with some board wipes?
Yeah.
How about one that we mentioned quite recently, Austere Command?
Mm-hmm.
We don't have to get into this one too much because we were just talking about, in our modal episode, just how versatile of a board wipe this is. And that is the very reason I have it included here. Austere Command 4 white for a sorcery. Choose 2. Destroy all artifacts or destroy all enchantments. or destroy all creatures mana value 3 or less, or destroy all creatures mana value 4 or greater.
What's the problem on the board? Get rid of it.
Exactly.
The end.
Save the things that I want to save.
What else you got?
We have a couple of other board wipes in here. We have the Ondu Inversion, and we have the far, far more powerful Cyclonic Rift, of course. Got to run Cyclonic Rift. 1 and a blue for an instant. Return target non-land permanent you control to its owner's hand with Overload for 6 and a blue. Everyone knows this effect. It's the most powerful board wipe in the game. I mean, good luck after you get hit by this.
Ban it. I hate
it's
it.
It's an instant speed board wipe. It's so strong. It's so strong,
so
Mike.
good.
And then we have another one. Play of the Game. Play of the Game is a sorcery, 6 white with assist. Another player can pay up to 6 generic of this spell's cost. And the effect says exile all non-land permanents. Now, you might be wondering, this is a really expensive spell. Like, how the hell are you going to get somebody to help you pay for it? The fact of the matter is, Mike, that when this spell needs to be cast, it's probably quite likely that the other players at the table are just scrambling to find this kind of answer. This is the kind of answer that ends the plans of the archenemy. Everything gets exiled.
Yep.
And you may be able to find somebody willing to reduce this cost so then you can start rebuilding right away. Because when things get this bad, you're likely not the only person who noticed things got this bad.
Sure. It's...
Sometimes you need to press the big red reset button, Mike.
Yeah, no, it's totally reasonable.
It's definitely not an every game spell.
Getting even one player to help you out isn't usually too hard with
Even
this.
if they just spend like a couple of mana, now suddenly it's a 6 mana board wipe.
Nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
We also have spot removal, and lots of it.
Yeah.
But we have some different varieties of spot removal. For instance, we have absolutely classic Chaos War. Love this spell. 2 and a red for an instant. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into their library, then reveals the top card. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield.
Yep. It's a staple.
It's great fun. The chances of them getting something worse than what you removed is very low. But even if they do get something worse, at least that's really fun.
Right.
So you're like, oh no, they got it.
Also, not a terrible thing to cast on yourself.
Oh yeah, I love doing this on
what you
myself.
pull.
Cast it on one of my tokens and get maybe a hate piece. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Also have talked about Path to Exile for spot removal. We also have enchantment-based spot removal, which this deck likes because I can get enchantments back from the graveyard, and they count as non-creature spells. So these are very, very nice for dealing with commanders especially, because there are some sneaky commanders out there that will just find a way out. Like, you remove them, they're just going to get cast again. But we get cards like Darksteel Mutation. It gets a little bit harder. For 1 and a white, it's an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature is an insect artifact creature with power and toughness 0/1 and has indestructible, loses all other types, abilities, and creature types. So your commander is now an indestructible bug. Usually when you lignify or Song of the Dryad, the classic green auras that lock down a creature, usually the first reaction of that creature's controller is going to be to try to swing it in through combat and get somebody to blow it up.
Or use it as a blocker or something along those lines.
Exactly.
Damage it in some way to where they can get their commander back.
This makes that strategy almost impossible.
Bye.
Because it's indestructible. And having no abilities, there are a lot of effects that basically say, oh, well, this creature can't attack, can't block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. There are a lot of commanders that have really powerful abilities that are either static or triggered abilities, and they aren't activated. So those effects are not enough. You need something that removes the abilities of their commander. And speaking of, we have another effect just like it, but it can also hit some other card types. And Mike, this is the flavor win, Imprisoned in the Moon.
Yep.
For 2 and a blue, it's an enchantment aura. Enchant creature, land, or planeswalker. We got great options here. Enchanted permanent is a colorless land with tap at colorless and loses all other card types and abilities. And as for the flavor, this is when Emrakul mind controlled Tamiyo to lock her in the Moon of Innistrad. And that's the last that we ever saw of her.
Mm-hmm. That'll happen.
Yeah, the phenomenal thing about this is that this is, to my knowledge, the only Lignify effect that can successfully lock down a Planeswalker commander.
Yeah.
Like, sure, you can attack into a Planeswalker commander and kill it and make them recast it, but how many effects actually keep that commander locked down? Because we know about O-Ring effects that will exile the permanent, but most people will probably just let it go to the command zone and just recast it, because they don't know when they're going to be able to remove that piece.
Right.
Being able to lignify to make a creature lose all of its abilities is far more powerful, because now their options are very limited. They either have to find a way to blow up the aura, or they have to find a way to sacrifice a non-land permanent, which very few decks are able to do.
Exactly.
Sacrifice a land.
It's Darksteel mutation, but still harder to be able to get rid of.
Yeah, because now it's not even a creature, now it's a land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very good. So these are some of the ways that you're removing threats from being an issue. Why don't we talk about some of the ways that you stop things from ever becoming threats? Let's talk about the control pieces.
Perfect. So for control pieces, I have a counterspell package. Mm-hmm. And also a few other cards. Let's talk about a few of our counterspells here. Start with a nice classic Mana Drain. This is just the best counterspell in the game of Commander. Blue for an instant counter target spell. At the beginning of your next main phase, add an amount of colorless equal to that spell's mana value. Mike, there's no reason, other than cost, of course, that you would not run this over Counterspell. This is just Counterspell, but you get free mana. And frankly, the kinds of spells that I want to be countering are big splashy things that I don't want to resolve that cost a lot of mana. And now I have that mana, and that's fantastic. This is a very expensive card, so don't break the bank going for it. A normal Counterspell works fine, but this is just a very, very nice upgrade. But we also have some more and different counterspells. How about Muddle the Mixture?
Yeah.
I really like this one, Mike. This is a common counterspell from Ravnica. It's blue. Counter target instant or sorcery spell. Now that is pretty limited. Sure. However, it is a 2-mana instant speed counterspell. However, we have upside. We have Transmute for 1 blue. Mm-hmm. And that means if you pay 1 blue and discard this card from your hand, you can tutor out a 2-mana value card and put that card into your hand.
Yes.
So this can get any 2-mana value card in my deck. For example, Cyclonic Rift.
Sure.
Or many of my Mana Rocks. Mm-hmm. Or
a lot of the hate
many
pieces.
of my hate pieces, like Containment Priest.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be able to find a lot of different and varied things. Torpor.
Absolutely.
It's just a good tutor to have. It's always nice to have a card that does something and is also a tutor. Transmute is also on Teleria West, which is a great land. It does the same thing, but since it's a land, it finds a CMC 0 card. Have some other counterspells here. How about Render Silent? This is a more expensive counterspell for white blue for an instant counter target spell, and its controller can't cast spells this turn.
That's rough.
This is the exact really kind of counterspell. Yeah, for 1 extra mana, this is a fantastic upside, because if I know that this is the turn that they're going to go off and try to win, well, now they just can't. They just straight up can't. And now they're wide open with everything committed to the board. They have to counter this counterspell, because if they don't, their turn is over.
It's such a gross spell. If this was one generic and 2 blue would be a $70 card as far as I'm concerned. It's so good.
It makes sense as an Azoria spell, but yes, it's very strong.
It really does.
It's good to keep in mind this only hoses one player, and that's what this deck is all about. We're hosing the big bad. And speaking of, here's another funny little counter spell that I think you and I both have a great appreciation for, Mike, and that's Sudden Substitution.
Yeah!
This is 2 blue for an instant with split second. Exchange control of target non-creature spell and target creature. Then the spell's controller may choose new targets for it. Mike, there are about 1,000,000,001 uses for this effect, but the fact of the matter is that I will always have a creature that I'm able to give up because I have tokens. When I cast a spell, I make a token.
You make a token, yeah.
Yep. I can gain control of their spell. I can gain control of their best creature and force a spell onto them. There's so many different ways to use this effect, and like, what are they going to do with one token when I steal their best spell?
Right.
And it has split second. This cannot be counterspelled.
Yeah. It is a very good way to effectively say, no. Not only are you not, but I am now. Enjoy your spirit.
Now, the last counterspell I'll talk about here is maybe strictly speaking not as powerful as Mana Drain, but practically speaking, especially near the end of the game, this counterspell just completely shuts people down, Mike, and that's Forbid.
Yeah.
Forbid is 1 blue counter target spell with buyback, discard 2 cards.
Yep.
As long as they don't have a counterspell, they can't do anything. Because late in the game, I've drawn a lot of cards. I'm willing to discard cards because I can reanimate them. And Mike, we've talked about this. Once I reveal that I have a counterspell that I'm willing to buy back and cast again, do you really think they're going to be wanting to cast a bunch of spells? I don't think so.
It's real hard to get around it at that point. You have to run out of resources, which you're making every time you're casting it, as well as having a way to get around it and hoping that it's too hard to get rid of. Depending on the situation, that's just an ender.
The last control piece I'll talk about here is not a counterspell, but this is going to basically just make my entire deck run more smoothly.
Sure.
And shout out to Josh Lequide. This is the blue version of what is perhaps his famous card and what he is most infamous for. And that is Leyline of Anticipation. Leyline of Anticipation is 2 blue for an enchantment. If Leyline of Anticipation is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with this card on the battlefield. And it says you may cast spells as though they had flash, which is instant speed. Frankly, even if you have to pay full cost for the spell, for a deck like this that needs to play reactively, this is a deck that is specifically trying to stop people from doing things. So there's going to be a lot of times when it would be really great to get out a hate piece like an enchantment at instant speed on the opponent's turn when they can't see it coming. Right.
It's...
Like, this is one of your favorite cards, right? Like, you love Vidalcan Orrery. You think it's a phenomenally powerful card. And I think you feel the same way about this card.
It is a very powerful card. That's the problem. I don't hate it.
Well, you notice I'm not running both.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it very much belongs in a deck like this.
Yes.
It belongs in a deck like this because what it does is it takes all of this stuff that's already oppressive and it can turn it into full-fledged, can't be stopped.
This is basically you lift off the ground 6 feet in the air and now you're like, what are you going to do now?
Yeah. Good luck reaching me.
Exactly.
So that's how we control things. That's how we stop people. That's how we remove people. That's how we protect ourselves. This is how we generate the hate. How we get the cards for the hate. How does it win? Now, you touched on it a little bit before with the Mindslaver and Academy Ruins combo. Go ahead and go over that briefly.
Okay. So let's go ahead and read both of those cards. We talked about this in our Commander Spellbook staff interview episode, which you can definitely go listen to, but we'll talk about this again. Academy Ruins is a legendary land with tap add colorless and the activated ability pay 1 blue and tap, put target artifact card from your graveyard on top of your library. And likewise, we have what is perhaps one of my favorite cards of all time, and that's Mindslaver. Mindslaver is a 6-mana artifact, legendary artifact, with pay 4 tap and sacrifice it. You control target player's next turn.
Yep.
Those are the words that I love to read, Mike. What?
I bet.
As soon as I take control of your turn, that's the ultimate hose. You're donezo. And the nice thing about this combo, Mike, is that I'm not only going to take control of their turn once, I'm going to activate Mindslaver to take control of their next turn, and then I will take their turn for them. And then, before their turn ends, I'm going to use Academy Ruins to move Mindslaver from my graveyard to the top of my library. On my turn, I'll draw it, I'll play it again, and I'll activate it and sacrifice it again. Now, this is literally only going to lock out one player, as I said before. However, they're host. There is almost nothing they can do at this point. Unless they have instant speed graveyard removal, which, yeah, that would work.
Yeah.
Other than that, convincing the other players that you don't want to die, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to work out very well for you. So that's our main win con, Mike. I'm trying to get to Mindslaver and Academy Ruins and get 13 mana on board. And then just every single time I get to my turn, I'll spend that mana to activate Mindslaver and then get it back. This is a very brutal lock, but I mean, if you're looking for a way to make a stacks deck that only wants to hurt one player win, you'd be hard pressed to find a better and more appropriate win con than this, in my opinion.
I mean, if you're into the end game of you and one other player, it's a win. If it's getting other people out of the game, it still works. It's very powerful. It's also why it is an infamous effect.
Yes.
One of the, well, I wouldn't say less infamous, but less known. Still infamous
but
in its
equally
own
as
right.
powerful.
Yes. Talk to me about the other win con here.
Yeah, so our other win con is in case somebody gets smart and does some instant speed graveyard removal, I was just saying, and they get rid of Mindslaver forever. We don't want that to happen. But if that does happen, we do have a backup, Mike. And that is another favorite of mine, Solemnity Decree of Silence lock. Oh my god, is this card brutal, Mike. This is almost as bad as Mindslaver.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Decree of Silence first, which is just your bog standard, extremely expensive counterspell enchantment.
Yep.
Bog standard. This is a completely unique card. This doesn't exist anywhere.
Nope.
Decree of Silence. 6 blue
Oof.
for an enchantment. Whenever an opponent casts a spell, counter that spell and put a depletion counter on Decree of Silence. Then, if there are 3 or more depletion counters on Decree of Silence, sacrifice it.
Sure.
And it also has cycling for blue. When you cycle Decree of Silence, counter target spell.
Card decides that it's going to counter 3 spells from your opponents. Neat.
Right. So basically never use the cycling ability, but when this comes out, it's going to counter the next 3 spells to get played. And who wants that to happen? Even just by itself. Like, I mean, come on. You don't want to have to sacrifice spell. Like, you would want to sort of distribute that labor and say, okay, well, Dana, can you cast a spell into this? Just like a random spell to get rid of something, and I'll cast a random spell into it and it'll get countered. And then between the 3 of us, we'll get rid of it. That seems pretty unlikely to happen in this case, but this wouldn't really be a lock, Mike, if it didn't have a way to actually lock things down. Let's talk about Solemnity. Now, this is a hate piece all of its own.
Yes.
There are decks that this will just hate out by itself without Decree of Silence. Solemnity 2 and a white for an enchantment. Players can't get counters, and counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So your +1/+1 counter deck, your -1/-1 counter deck, your energy counter deck, your experience counter deck, your infect deck. This is going to host a lot of different kinds of decks that involve counters. But we've already gone through our hate section. This can also be used as part of the lock. Because when we say counters can't be put on enchantments, and we look back at Decree of Silence and we see
it is an
that it is an enchantment, that's right. It's looking for other players to cast spells for it to counter, and then it puts counters on itself, and then it waits until 3 counters are on itself to be sacrificed. If those counters are never put on, it's never going to be sacrificed, no matter how many spells it counters, and it will counter every single spell. So that's a proper lock.
It's a good way to say no one is casting spells for the rest of the game except for me. Who wants to shuffle up?
It's worth noting, if you've been just listening to this episode with your jaw on the floor, like, how can you treat your fellow EDH players like that, Alex? I'm ashamed of you. Let's back up. This is not for your normal fun Friday night Magic pod. This is not for playing with friends. This is for, you are in your LGS. There is somebody at your pod with a deck that is way more powerful than anyone else's. And they're either the only game in town, or you're kind of stuck with them for now. This happens to all of us. You have that one friend, he only has one deck, and it's really mean. This is your solution to that.
You specifically mentioned it at the beginning. I think, and everything you just said, absolutely true. The keywords that you said at the beginning, and I think are almost something that go on the title of the deck, are, this is not the first deck that you play with.
No.
This is a deck that is summoned by somebody else.
Right. When you bring out your Urza, this is what comes back, a bird.
Yes.
And
you still let them play that deck.
Oh, yeah. I don't complain at them like you can't play that deck. I'm going to say, listen, I have a deck here, and this deck only exists to make your life miserable, and only yours.
Yep. Like all other things, we announce what we're planning on doing. We have the table know, our intents are known, and then we play the game.
This is not a sneaky deck. This is not a mean vindictive deck. This is, hey, you can play that 8 or that 9, but I just want you to know that I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure that your deck is completely constricted and can't do anything at all. And I'm going to make you lose the game super hard. And you know what?
Hold on. And why are you doing that?
I'm doing that because you're playing a deck that's too strong for this pod.
Okay. So here's the thing. I love you as a human being. This is a mean deck, and that is the definition of vindictive. But it's justified, and that is the real thing here. That is the real thing here. So when we say it's not a mean deck, it's not a vindictive deck, oh, it is. But it has reasons. And that's the kind of stacks that I'm okay with. If you're doing it for a reason, if the entire premise of the game is not to make everybody miserable and not play the game of Magic, I'm uncomfortable. But if you're playing a deck where you're bringing somebody else back down to the level that they put everybody at the game before, great. Because they've broken the social contract as far as I'm concerned. We're here, we're doing this to have a fun time, cool, no big deal. Like, put it this way. If we're ever doing a cardboard combat stream on Thursday nights on the Twitch channel, and this deck comes out, we've done something wrong. Like that is a failure on our part.
That seems unlikely to happen.
Absolutely,
and that's probably why you haven't seen this deck before.
I've seen it. I just haven't seen it in a long time. No, I know you've seen it, but
our listeners certainly haven't.
And that's what I want to get to.
Right.
This is a deck I know about. I'm very familiar with this deck. How long was I playing Magic with you consistently? Like 2 years?
Yeah.
3 years? Like, it was a decent amount of time. I've seen this deck in action maybe like 4 times.
Right.
Because it exists to literally say, hey, we're going to have our come to Urza moment, essentially. we need to have a conversation here, friend.
You know,
that wasn't very cool.
we've been talking about all this of like, oh, we have to slap their hand, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
It's worth mentioning that there are players out there who legitimately enjoy the experience of building a very powerful deck and just being the arch enemy for the whole game.
Which is fine, honestly.
And for those players, this is the deck that you want to play against.
Yes. Even if you sit down and you say, I have a very, very powerful deck. I am letting you all know, either play your most powerful stuff, band together against me, whatever. That's
is the deck
totally
that I
fine.
Bring out.
And that's the deck that you bring out.
Yep.
And then, frankly, if somebody says that, and I think that has happened before, where somebody said that, and then you brought out that deck, and I just looked at the other person at the table,
Like, you're
that
screwed,
hadn't pulled
buddy.
out a deck yet. Well, no, the other person at the table, and I was just kind of like, me and you are going to play our own game. They're going to go at each other. Me and you are playing together.
This is what I bring out when somebody sits across from me with a Jingataxias deck. Jingataxias. Never bring a Jingataxias deck to a pod. But if you do, you're going to meet Kykar, and you're going to lose to a bird.
That's not true. Never not bring anything to your table. Just be ready for whatever comes out of the other players because of that. You know what? I think Jingataxias is a pretty good way to end the podcast because that's where we're at. So, Alex, thank you very much for talking about the Kykar deck with us.
Absolutely.
Where can people find you on socials if they have any questions for you?
Sure. You can get me on Twitter at Lappermedic, LAPPERMEDIC. You can just tweet at me or DM me with any judge questions you may have, or you can email me directly at alex@edhrec.com.
So we're going to put a link to the tapped out deck list in our show notes. One thing I do want to point out about this deck is it seems real expensive. And then you look at it, and the reason that it's real expensive is because of a total of like 8 cards.
Right.
Which, you know, we've got our dual lands, we've got our Academy Rector, we've got a couple of those cards that are really inflating the overall price. You don't need all those cards. No. You can make this deck pretty functional for a much more reasonable price. Oh, yeah. So keep that in mind.
Cheap. Most hate pieces are actually pretty cheap.
Yep.
And again, you're going to want to tune the hate package to your meta.
Yes.
You don't want to just bring in please net deck my deck, but don't net deck it without making it your own. And that's not because, you're stealing from me. I want you to make this deck and make it work for you at your pod. And the way that I built it is almost certainly not going to be very effective at your pod.
No. Unless most pods are running the same kind of people.
Well, it's going to get
whatever.
It's going to get a good few chunks of your decks, but I'm willing to bet that the specific problem deck that you're thinking of probably isn't represented here because everyone's problem deck is going to be different.
Yep. Just a little bit. And that's why it's a deck that you can adjust pretty easily. So we'll have the deck list in our show notes. We'll also have our Discord link in our show notes here. Come join us. We've been communicating with some people as far as some cards that we're going to be using. And can I see that in the very near future? If you have any questions for Alex as a judge, that's a pretty good way to be able to get in contact with him, everybody. Mm-hmm. That's how I've done it all of these years. And well, now we're just offering the opportunity for the rest of you. We can ask you very silly questions like whether or not Angel's Grace works with commander damage, and not a question that anybody should have to ask at any time, but our judge is able to figure it out because he's a smart dude. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter at EDH_social or email us at thesocialcontractedh@gmail.com. Hope you really enjoyed the deck tech. We'll talk to you next week.